You got to turn it on first.
It's just a little switch.
Why are Matt and Nate so far back?
It's not a huge widescreen,
Oh, it's.
so if you really want to
it's
see
coffee
some of the stuff on
chocolate
it,
mix.
you might want to come forward. Just a suggestion.
In the basement.
Okay.
Yes, there's coffee in the basement.
Okay.
It's going to go that way.
No,
Safer. So, well, thank you for coming back. Just a general synopsis of the first two sessions. This is the third session.
At his house, yeah, we can street it. Yeah.
Come on, Brian.
Shut up, and now you're not.
I was like, I didn't bring it in this time.
First session, we talked a little bit about what people believe, what churches teach relative to the creationism and evolution perspectives on how we got here. Came to the realization that, frankly, our churches really don't stress creationism at an extent that I would have assumed. So it comes down to even of those people who do go to church regularly, only about 60% would believe in creationism as a standard 6-day event at the beginning of Genesis. From there, we went into what the Bible says, and we read through Genesis, or didn't read through the entire section, but we reviewed Genesis 1 through 11, and from that looked at the creation story happens overall in Genesis 1. Genesis 2 refocuses on day 6 and the creation of man. And then Genesis 3 and 4 goes over the fall. Adam and Eve sin against God in chapter 3, and Cain and Abel sin against each other, or sin between man when there's a murder going on, homicide. Pretty obviously who did it though.
Yeah, that's true.
And in chapter 4. And then in chapter 5 they pick up a genealogy from Adam through Noah. 6 picks up talking about Noah and the ark and the flood, and the animals go through 6, 7, and 8. 9 moves into the land and then on to the Tower of Babel. 10 is the Tower of Babel, and then 11 is the spread, and then moving on into the genealogy continuing. So we have a genealogy that happens within the first 11 chapters of Genesis that tracks us from Adam through Abraham. And from Abraham to current is a fairly well accepted duration of time that people don't really argue too much, I'll say. There are some who will point out issues that might swing things 1,000 years, plus or minus. Overall scope of things, the Bible would present a timeline that says we're basically 2,000 years from creation to Abraham, basically 2,000 years from the flood to 2,000 years from creation to the flood, 2,000 years from the flood to Christ, and then 2,000 years from Christ to us. So we come up with basically 6,000. You'll get numbers that are 7, 8, maybe 9 by some people. But in the end, it's a heck of a lot less than 4.6 billion years that the evolutionists would come up with. Then we went through the Bible's perspective, or comparing the Bible's account to the viewpoints that try to mix the two views, theistic evolution, and I argued all the typical potential views of where you stick in 4.5 billion years, and presented why they don't logically work in any case. And then we moved into material on what we see around us in the world here this afternoon, and looked at geological layers, canyon formation, erosion rates, and then also into space, red giants, red dwarfs, white giants.
No, you
No,
had
I
it.
switched. Red giants, white dwarfs.
Yeah.
Moon dust, things like that. And then on back to the Earth with different questions about fossil generation, how quickly or what has to happen for a fossil to be formed. And then we looked at the various mineral depositing schemes of permineralization, which would be cave formations, petrified wood, and then into the time frames it takes to generate your fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, diamonds, and gems. And then, I might have left out one or two things, but in the end we come to here, where now we're looking more at the animal kingdom. We'll start out with some of the dating methodology that evolutionists depend upon in the uniformitarianism scheme to come up with large dates, and discuss carbon dating, carbon-14 dating, as well as the other radiometric methods. And then from there, go into more specifically the flood, the ark. Could a ship that size have been built? Could it have survived the most likely scenario of how rough the water would have been? And was it big enough to hold all the animals? Discussion a little bit about animal kinds and how many animals it would take to truly do that. And then from there, the realization that dinosaurs lived with man and dinosaurs were on the ark, and what do we have to substantiate that? And that's the evening. So, dinosaurs. No one denies that dinosaurs existed. The fossil record establishes that, and I definitely, as one, strongly believe it. They existed. The question is, when did they exist? Millions of years ago or thousands of years ago? Let's first look at a chart that probably many of you are seeing something like this, a little bit different here and there, in school. Okay? That's a chart. It's a scan, not high resolution, so it doesn't matter that much. But it's a general chart showing layers of rock with names for each layer: Cambrian, can't even read them, but they're all there: Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Tertiary up top, with the index fossils that would relate to those layers and the time frames. And the time frames, go back, in this case, here we are at the Precambrian bedrock at 4.6 billion years ago. It also mentions the type of plant life that was expected to be growing at that point in time, as well as a general age of description: age of invertebrates, age of amphibians, age of reptiles, age of mammals. The problem is, this chart was devised back in the early 1800s. Okay? These layers are supposed to be, a assumption of how the animals would be distributed within geographic layers that you can find in a location. It's geared to the theory of evolution, and it diagrams over 500 million years in impressive rock layers. The problem is, no complete stack of these layers exists, where the fossils that they say they are as index fossils actually exist in the layers as this shows. So they deem the layers as defined by index fossils. The trilobite is one of the typical index fossils in one of those very early stages. So the question is, how old is it? Well, this goes back to when dating methods first started. And at that point in time, you ask a paleontologist how old that trilobite is. And he would say, well, where did you find it? And he'd say, we found it in this dirt. He said, he'd ask the geologist how old is the dirt. And the geologist would identify the layer as Cambrian, and then he'd look at the chart and ask you, or tell you that it's 450 million years old. You ask the geologist how old the rock is, and he will ask you what you found in it. And when you say you found trilobites in it, he'll look at the chart and tell you it's 450 million years old. Circular reasoning. World Book Encyclopedia states this exactly as that is. In 1978, volume 15, so my study goes back a ways, page 85. The age of rocks may be determined by the fossils found in them. World Book Encyclopedia. Same year, different volume. Scientists determined when fossils were formed by finding out the age of the rocks in which they lie. You can't make any of these assumptions, because obviously circular reasoning doesn't work. You can't make this up. Others agree. Encyclopedia Britannica itself stated, geologists are arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by the study of the remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms they contain. But you have to come up with that, because there was no other way, reliably enough, to date the components in and of themselves. And so that's where we'll be going here in a second. But if trilobites really are 450 million years old, then it raises questions when you see a fossil like this.
Now, this would appear to be a fossil of a trilobite in the fossil remains of a shoe print. Now, you will find people who argue, well, this formation is a condition that can happen in certain rock formations when you break things apart, which this was a combined system, component, and it was, you crack it apart, so this is the opposite peanut butter and jelly sandwich here, and so that formation is there and there. They say it's quite common for this type of thing to break up and gave a pattern that just so happened to look like a shoe print. Right or wrong, it raises a strong question that if it is a shoe print, the dating would not work. This was found 43 miles northwest of Delta, Utah back in 1968. Another index fossil is the coelacanth. It's an index fossil that correlates to one of the later time periods. I don't know off the top of my head which one it is. Kids have been taught that this is the link between fish and land animals. The general feeling early on has been presented that these are the first fins that are starting to develop into legs. So that it was starting to also develop lungs probably. It had a larger brain than average, and that it was going to be walking out of the swamps fairly soon, about 70 million years ago. Problem is this a true statement to latch onto? Well, they're still alive. They were found in the Indian Ocean back in the late 1930s. Hundreds have been seen since then, and they're still in the ocean as far as we can tell. Now, some people would say that just because some of them evolved doesn't mean they all evolved, and the rest of them could still be there. But this is a fossil record item that is still alive today. So if this is deemed a dinosaur from that period, it's still alive exactly as it was back then. So dating fossils. Paleontologists will tell you that sediment is laid down slowly over time, so a fossil can easily be dated by the layer it's in. So the question would be, how old is this tree? The problem is, that's not the real tree, that's the real tree. Polystrate fossil. In this case, I guess the bottom of the tree is 200 million years old, and the top of the tree is 100 million years old. Obviously, that's not the case. So you've got sedimentary layers. I mean, you can see the layers broken out in here, a large scan of them. The question is, how does that happen? The layers had been laid down in a one-time event, still staying semi-soft, and then somehow the tree gets upright in it. It turns out this event is actually quite common. This happens all over the place, specifically after large volcanic activity. Okay? A polystrate fossil is any fossil that extends through several layers of sediment. Examples are most common with tree trunks that have also been found with fish and even a whale. Tree trunk in this case actually extends from a coal seam through several layers and then into another coal seam at the top. Once again, how does this happen? In Mount St. Helens eruption back in 1980, it leveled an entire forest of trees. Okay, here's the remains, and you can see all these trees here knocked down. Thousands of acres of trees destroyed. In Spirit Lake, down at the bottom of the hill, millions of trees were blown into this lake, to the point that you could walk across the lake, tree to tree to tree, all the way across the lake. There's a person down here on top of these logs. Okay, so you got all these logs sitting here on the lake. They're not going to flow anywhere because they're jammed up. Eventually, what happens to logs when they're in water? They get waterlogged. So at some point in time, the density is going to change and they're going to try to sink. It's quite common for one end to get denser faster than the other, and so what happens? They'll stand upright. Here's pictures of Mount St. Helens. Logs are upright. The density changes enough over time from getting waterlogged, they start to sink and then plummet to the bottom. Puncture through many layers of sediment that are fresh down there at the bottom, and then when things dry up or otherwise, they're fossils through many layers. Petrified trees in Arizona. This is an interesting one. The perspective that a petrified tree contains fossils of the nests of bees in it and the cocoons of wasps. Problem is, the tree has been dated to 220 million years old. The problem is, the plant life that the bees live off of hadn't yet been dated until 100 million years old. So the bees had nothing to live off of for over 100 million years. Fossilizing pollinating insects have been dated 25 million years before the flowers they live on supposedly developed. Just a few perplexing situations. It's well established, apparently, that the Mesozoic era was between 280 million years and 65 million years ago. And most mammals were no larger than today's mice or rats. Okay, because this was in the age of the reptiles. The dinosaurs were the masters of the land. So since mammals couldn't compete for food, only the small little squirrel-sized animals and things could live and survive. Or at least that's the perspective that's presented. Unfortunately, the community needs to rethink it a little bit because the fossilized this guy, he's a mammal, about the size of a small dog. Okay, so not a squirrel-sized thing, but a dog. Had this dinosaur, Pitacosaurus, in its stomach. So obviously mammals were eating dinosaurs during this time period. In fact, this shows a fossil of the robustus, and this shows another fossil of a robustus with stomach content still intact. The stomach contents, they say they can look at these stomach contents and from this analyze it with x-rays and determine the bones that are in there, and from 20 bone fragments determine that was a dinosaur, which makes this story make sense to me, that it raises the question, but I'll have to say it. You're pushing your ability to engineer a creature from bone fragments when all you have is that inside of a stomach, just to be honest. So how did they come up with 100 million plus years anyway, outside of the circular logic we've described so far? Meaning they have to come up with 4.5 billion years. They create the chart of how things would spread out, and then you date the soil by what's buried in it, and date what's buried in it by the soil. Well, carbon dating, that's one of the key items presented. The problem is carbon dating, C14, is a method developed to date carbon-based material back in 1947, 7 years after Martin Kamen discovered the radioactive isotope C14. He won the Nobel Prize for it in 1960. All living things have carbon-14 in them, okay? Carbon-12 and carbon-14. Carbon-12 is the standard carbon molecule, okay? So carbon-14 has 2 extra isotopes in it. So while all living things take in carbon and then release it out, but they only release carbon-14 when they die. That's the assumption of the process that Kamen came up with. So throughout life, when something is alive, they take in carbon-12 and carbon-14, but they only give off carbon-12, but when it dies, now you have a certain mixture of carbon-14 within them. It is a radioactive isotope within the scale of carbon, so it's not truly radioactive by the sense of plutonium type stuff. But it has a half-life, so it actually releases the isotopes that are in it at a rate that can be measured, or so they claim is. And by knowing, tracking what the new ratio is, you can tell how long ago something died. Okay? So carbon-14 is made up when cosmic rays knock neutrons out of the atomic nuclei in the upper atmosphere. These displaced neutrons now move faster and hit ordinary nitrogen, nitrogen-14, and when they do that, at lower altitudes, they convert the nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. So unlike common carbon, carbon-12, C14 is unstable and slowly decays, changing it back to nitrogen in time, releasing energy. So this instability makes it radioactive. Stated simply, carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, whereas carbon-14 has picked up 2 spare neutrons. So it's got 6 protons, 8 neutrons. And to have an unstable nucleus with an atomic mass of 14. The half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,730 years. That is to say, it'll take 5,730 years for the amount of carbon-14 in an item to decay to half of that. Okay? So in 2 half-lives, or 11,460, it'll go to 1/4 of the original. In another third of that, and that would be 16, just over 17,000, you'd have 1/8 of the original, etc., etc. Thing is, it starts out at a pretty small amount, so at some point in time, the amount gets so small you can really no longer measure it. And so the question is, how accurately can you go and continue measuring when it drops by, halfway to halfway to half to half to half? Well, in general, the mechanisms back when this paper was being done said you really can't measure anything older than about 50,000 years with carbon-14 dating. Now, methods have improved. I'll buy off, okay, we have the ability to measure contents now maybe up to 100,000 years. But when it all comes down to it, you still have to make the assumptions that everything relative to the beginning content and the process has been uniform throughout time. And that's where errors occur often. So for this method of dating to work, various issues need to be addressed. Several issues. Plants discriminate between CO2 containing C14. They take up less than you would expect them to, and so they test older than they really are. The ratio of C14 to C12 in the atmosphere has not been constant. For example, we know for sure that it was higher during the Industrial Revolution, especially early Industrial Revolution, when massive burning of fossil fuels released a lot of carbon dioxide that was depleted in C14, so the ratio of the atmosphere changed. Okay. Then there was a rise in carbon-14 with the advent of atmospheric nuclear bomb testing back in the 1950s. So that changed the ratio again. So the uniformitarian view of the amount of C14 in the atmosphere has changed, and therefore it's not uniformitarianism. The amount of cosmic rays penetrating the Earth's atmosphere affects the C14 produced. Well, the amount of carbon-14 reaching the Earth varies with the sun's activities and the Earth passes through magnetic clouds as the solar system travels through the Milky Way. So that would affect the rate of decay of systems. The strength of the Earth's magnetic field also affects things, and we know for sure the field is slowly collapsing. Overall, the energy of the Earth's magnetic field has decreased, so more C14 is being produced now than in the past. This will make old things look older than they really are. Also, the flood would have had a huge impact on it for those who believe in a world flood event. It would have upset the carbon balance. Flood buried a huge amount of carbon, which became coal, oil, etc., lowering the total carbon-12 in the biosphere. Therefore, the total C14 would be proportionately lower at this time, but whereas no terrestrial process generates any more C12, C14 is continually being produced at a rate which does not depend upon carbon levels. So a lot of talk there that I'm sure if you weren't taking notes, in which I doubt any of you are, well actually one person is, all this is saying there are a lot of things going on in the atmosphere and the Earth that would affect or would explain, I guess really point out, that uniformitarian view on the decay rate of carbon-14 is unsubstantiated. Okay? Volcanoes emit much carbon or CO2 as well, depleting the CO2 balance as well. So taking all these into account, researchers have suggested that the dates of 35,000 to 45,000 years should be recalibrated, and taking these examples of things they have come up with and said it could actually shift things almost by an order of magnitude down into the 3,500 to 4,500 year range. So even if you accept that by taking these assumptions into mind and varying your calculation ability to create accurately, you could theoretically say you can get the numbers to work out right. Even if you assume that's correct, which I really don't, there are issues that result in seeing the results, okay? When corrected for the effects of the flood, you can get useful results, but it needs to be applied carefully. It does not give dates of millions of years when corrected properly. And when corrected properly, it fits well with the biblical flood. That's what I was talking about earlier. But the problem is here. Even if you can work the numbers to try to theoretically address the variables, the method still produces results that are extremely variable. A fresh seal skin was dated to 1,300 years old. The animal had just died. A live mollusk was dated to 2,300 years old. An antler cut into 3 pieces. One piece was 5,300 years old, one was 9,300 years old, one was 10,000 years old. So obviously there's still issues in your ability to use carbon-14 dating for things. But once again, in the end, everyone agrees 50,000 years, maybe 70 or 80,000 years is about the limit for carbon-14. So if you're looking at truly old devices, carbon-14 is not going to get you there, okay? Carbon dating in many cases seriously embarrasses evolutionists by giving ages that are much younger than those expected, okay? So I just showed examples of things that frankly should have been young and came back fairly old, relatively speaking. But there's also the exact opposite condition. There are things that by an evolutionary timescale shouldn't have any carbon measurable in them, okay? Coal, diamonds, other gems that are made from carbon-based material that are millions of years old should have zero measurable carbon-14 in them, based upon the theory presented, okay? And yet, laboratories that measure carbon-14 would like a source of organic material with zero C14 in them to use as a blank to verify their equipment. The problem is that coal would be an obvious candidate, but the youngest coal is supposed to be millions of years old, or because the youngest coal is supposed to be millions of years old, and yet old coal should be devoid of C14. It isn't. No source of coal has been found that completely lacks any C14. Okay, so an item that is claimed to be millions of years old should have none, but they haven't found any that doesn't have any. Okay, so it defies the system to be able to produce something that their theory says should be true. Fossil wood found in Upper Permian rock that is supposedly 250 million years old still contained carbon-14. A sample of wood found in a rock classified as Middle Triassic, supposedly some 230 million years old, still had carbon-14 in it that dated the piece of wood to 33,000 years old, plus or minus 430 years. It's an unsolved mystery to evolutionists as to why coal, diamonds, or even meteorites still have carbon-14 in them. But for those of us who believe that this was all created 6,000 years ago, it makes perfect sense. Still within the range of something that could be going through radioactive decay. Carbon-14 dating is just one of many uniformitarian radioactive dating methods. Okay? This lists out several of them. Potassium-40 decays to argon, uranium-238 decays to lead-206, uranium-235 decays to lead-207, rubidium-87 decays to strontium-87. These are fairly well established radiometric dating isotopes that are used to determine the age of things that are much older. These are typically associated with rock, specifically igneous rock. And the belief is that when you run the decay rate calculation to date the item, it dates the rock back to when the rock changed from liquid form to solid form, because that's when it locks in the original content and the decay starts. The isotope concentrations can be measured very accurately. We can measure them. I'll buy off on that and no questions asked. But isotope concentrations are not dates. They're a measurement. To derive ages from such measurements, unprovable assumptions have to be made. Okay? The starting conditions have to be known, which of course, how would you know the starting conditions of something you're claiming is 2 billion years old? You don't. Decay rates have to remain constant. We don't know they remain constant. Systems have to be closed or isolated so that no parent or daughter isotopes are lost or added throughout the process. And then you got situations where you've got, we'll say, bad dates. What do you do with a bad date? When a date differs from what is expected, researchers readily invent excuses for rejecting the result. Okay, that sounds like just somebody who's trying to say that, poor science. Well, there are hundreds of recorded excuses on file where a lab has to throw out a number because it's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? Because it doesn't agree with what it should be. Okay. Example. Researchers applied posterior reasoning to the dating of Australopithecus remidus fossils. That's an early hominid ape that is assumed to be within the human evolutionary chain. Some samples of basalt closest to the fossil-bearing strata give dates that were about 23 million years